People often forget that anarchism in Islam actually has a close history. Although it doesn't go as deep compared to their contemporaries like Christianity and Buddhism, it does have a history nonetheless. In fact, unlike Christianity or Buddhism, where anarchist ideas were practically introduced way after the founder's death, this time is compared to a more recently. We can see the first schisms in Islam, and specifically the Qajarī, which was considered the third oldest sect within Islam besides Sunni and Shia. And unlike the other two, they have a more anarchist leaning. Today, we're going to read an academic peer-reviewed paper that explored this part by Patricia Crone in the 9th century Muslim anarchists. And to understand this, this view is our great intro to the point of early Islamic political thought and the history of anarchism alike, since they are largely unknown even to the scholars of Islam and yet to be discovered by historians of anarchism. All the anarchists came from the Basra in southern Iraq, or had their intellectual roots where they belonged or two quite different groups. Most of them were Mutsalites, that is, a member of a theological school of Basran origin, distinguished by its reliance on reason. Mutsalites were not necessarily or even usually anarchists. By the 9th century, Mutsalite hagiographer, presumed to be Jahar ibn Arb, implied that belief in a non-necessity of government was common among them in his days. His hearers includes Al-Asam, Al-Nasam, and Hisham al-Fuwat, and his pupils Abda ibn Sulayman, all of whom lived or began their careers in Basra, and were also called Musalite ascetics or Sufishat and Usasila, active in Baghdad. The other anarchists were Qadarites, that is to say, members of a mainly Basra sect which was notorious for its military intolerance. The Qadarites were not normally anarchists either, but one subset was, that is, the Nadiyah or the Nahajat, who had appeared in the 7th century and who seem to have survived into the 10th, possibly in Basra and possibly elsewhere. Whether Mutsalite or Qadarites, the views of the anarchists have been poorly preserved. Numerous sources mention that Mutsalites and Qadarites denied the necessity of the imamate, or roughly translated as legitimate government, but it was not only until Van Es published the hagiography now presumed to be Ja'far bin Arbs, generally referred to as pseudo-Nashi, and their laconic statement could be related to the context. This source also provides a clue to the identity of unnamed anarchists who appear in fragmentary episodes by Al-Jasif, the famous literature and Musalite of the non-anarchist variety. They can now be possibly identified as Musalite influenced by Al-Assam. In addition, Van Es has done an immense amount of groundwork on the anarchists without ever using the term in his Theology and Kashklaf, a monumental work which covers the doctrinal development of early Islamic world in 4 volumes on prosopography and analysis of Jew translations. The Muslims started with a very different set of conceptual tools. They saw as structures of domination had always existed and always would, for the universe itself was a kingdom, in the most literal sense of the word. The king of the universe was God, who ruled by legislation. At first sight, divine law as conceived by the Muslims looked much the same as the natural law of the Stoics, who often called their divine as well. But the conceptions are quite different. The natural law of the story was something built into nature, exemplified by nature, and available to all humans by virtue of their possession of reason. It was written into their hearts, as St. Paul put it, and thus wholly independent of human government. But the divine law of the Muslim was invariant of the model of positive law as something that had to be enacted, promulgated, and enforced with their particular community. The king had to send messengers in order for people to know it, and he had to raise up deputies of one kind or another in order to have it executed. Far from being independent of human government, divine law engendered it. You acknowledge God as your king by accepting membership of his polity. To live by his law is brought and execute his agents. God's government was conceived, he would not, of course, have used force if his subjects would obey him and their own accord. But some reason or another, they all tended to rebellious. There was nothing special about humans in this respect. God had sent armies against disobedient creatures even before humans had been created, and the human folk plays no role whatever in the Muslim view of why coercion government exists. Government has always existed and always would. It was an inescapable feature of the universe. Consequently, the Muslim Golden Age myth is not about the absence of government, but rather about its ideal form. The myth is set to Medina in the time of the Prophet and the first Caliph from 622 to 656. This is a well-remembered historical period rather than a hoary past, and is often an idealized version of the period rather than a complete fiction. Like the Stoics' account, it describes a simple society which was guided by wise men until things went wrong as they did when the first civil war broke out in 656. If not before, but unlike the Stoics, what counterpart starts with the foundation of polity, and it illustrates not contrast between divine law and human government, but on the contrary, their fusion. The Prophet and the first Caliphs were to bring and execute God's law, are ambiguously ambitious as rulers, not just as wise men, to impose penalties, conduct campaigns, suppress revolts, start the wars of conquest. In short, they use institutionalized violence, but they always do so in accordance with God's law. Nothing is wrong with coerce was institutions as long as they are properly used. To the basic position, ideal government was governed by the Imam, a communal leader who modeled himself on God's law, who has thus set an example to be imitated. The first Imam in human history was Adam. The first Imam in Islamic history was Muhammad. The Imams after him adopted the titles of Caliph, and their position was thereafter known as the Eminent, which stressed its legitimate nature. Now, as the Caliphate, which stressed its political reality, but they were all rulers of the same kind. Everything else was corruption in two opposite directions. On the one hand, some people transgressed against God by arrogance his power to themselves, leading to tyranny. This was the condition under which the non-Arabs had lived until their conquest by the Muslims. More precisely, they had lived under the kings, but all kings other than God himself were tyrants. For a king was somebody who wanted to power at God's expense, like the pharaohs. On the other hand, there were people who forgot about God and his law altogether, and so had no government at all. Statelessness was the condition in which the Arabs had lived before the rise of Islam. The Greeks had rather admired them for their ability to do without rulers, and they had certainly admired themselves for it. They boast endlessly of their refusal to submit to kings or everyone else in their poetry. But after the rise of Islam, they realized they have lived in pagan ignorance and barbarism. Jahiliyyah, a state of immorality and disorder, not condition of innocence, let alone one which was established of natural right to freedom of subordination, obligation, subordination, and all other kinds of revelation, for a religion was first and foremost a set of legal and moral obligations whereby human society was ordered. The Medina Caliphs started a middle course between tyranny and anarchy by adherence to God's law. To the vast majority of Muslims, they represent a political ideal, as indeed they still do. In short, coercive government was not a mere human convention, except so far as it had been preserved by kings. In its authentic form, it was a sacred institution which reflects the absolute. You could not have a moral order without a revealed law, and you could not have a revealed law without an imam to enforce this. This was the premise of which Muslims started. It was not easy to see how to get anarchism from here. Like everything else from imam to kingship, Muslims soon discovered that divine law and human government tended to be at loggerheads. By 800, Medina had long ceased to be a capital. The Muslim polity had long lost its simplicity, and the imams had long ceased to be a wise man dispensing friendly guidance, insofar as they were. The Abbasid Caliphate ruled a vast empire from Baghdad in a style all too reminiscent of pharaohs and his like. The emirates had turned into kingship, as people said. In other words, he had turned into tyranny. The question was that what should do about it. Islam had originated as an activist religion, and there were still people who say they were. Wherever you saw people act wrongly, you should take actions against them with a sword if necessary. If the ruler misbehaved, one had to rebel and replace it with another, provided that there was a reasonable chance of succeed. Most 9th century Muslims were of this opinion, as were all Qadarites of the non-anarchist variety. But the religious scholars who came to by the bearers of Sunni Islam were quietists, like the churchmen in the Middle Western Europes. In their view, civil war was more destructive for the community than such wrongs as tyrants could inflict on it, and preserving the community was more important than setting its leadership right. You had to obey the ruler, however sinful he was, unless he ordered you to disobey God himself, in which case you had to adopt passive resistance. There were even some who argued in the Christian style that tyrannical rulers were punishment for sin, but the anarchists proposed a third solution. We may start with the Mutsalai, who will get to the bulk of the attention. They offer a variety of arguments in favor of anarchism, but only one is quoted in full, that of the Muslim aesthetics. It went as follows. Islam is different from other religions. For other religions, communities had kings who enslaved their subjects, but the Prophet was not a king, nor were his successors. And if an imam desires to turn into a king by ceasing to govern in governance with the law, then the Muslim will be legally obligated to fight him and dispose him, as the activist says. But civil war was indeed terrible. It split the community, led to more violation of the law without guaranteeing a better outcome, as the quietist says. Since imams kept turning into kings, the best solution was to set them up in the first place. The Muslims ascetics did not deny there might be a legitimate ruler in the future. They seemed to have thought he would have to be an elite, or in other words, a descendant of the Prophet. But in the absence of such a ruler, it had to be better to have none. Al-Amsman's argument, which had to piece together from diverse passages, was based on premises that the imam was a ruler on whom all members of the community agree. Without such consensus, would not be an imam at all. This was widely accepted, and also the premises for the Natijah. Originally, the caliph ruled with communal agreement and had thus been true imams, according to Al-Asma, though not the Najadiyah. Nowadays, they do not. The community had grown too big. Like the ascetics, Al-Assam seems to have kept open possibility that there could be a true imam again one day, though he cannot have regarded as likely if he saw the size of the key problem, and certainly did not think that the imam would have to be an Ali or even an Arab. In any case, one had to look for alternatives while such a ruler was absent. Ishmael al-Fuwad subscribed to the variety versions of al-Saman's argument. According to him, the community only needed an imam where he was unanimous and rigorous, by which he appeared to have meant that it was only under such circumstances that it is possible and obligatory to elect one. In the past, it had been possible, but nowadays it was not. The community had grown disunity and sinful. His pupil, Abba-i Sulaiman, went so far as to declare a categorical term that there will never be an imam again. He too followed the one who had looked for alternatives. The Muslim anarchists were clearly regretful anarchists. They would not agree with Emma Gomez that all forms of government rest on violence, and therefore wrong and harmful as well as unnecessary. They viewed this was only true of government in the sense of kingship. The imam had been an exception, but it was no longer an exception. He had indeed come to rest on violence, and thus to be wrong, harmful, and unnecessary. This was the problem we're grappling with. The Musulai, as also the Natijah, declared the imminent unnecessary by denying that it was prescribed by religious law. A Muslim had to pray, fast, and fulfill other duties laid out by the law, but having an imam was not a duty of that kind, they say. They demonstrate this in different ways. Al-Assam, followed by Al-Nasim, famously declared that people will not need an imam if they will obey the law of their own accord. By this, it does not seem to have meant that such a situation could have brought about. But rather that one could envision a situation in which imams were appropriate, one could not deny the institution obligatory and basis on reason. No one seemed to agree at the time, and according to some presumed followers described by Al-Asi, the behavior of the Prophet's companion after his death also ruled out that he had been prescribed by him. In short, no legal obligation to have an institution existed. Abba-i Sulaiman, perhaps echoing Hisham al-Futal, who used the very fact that doubts about the possibility of having a legitimate imam had a right to demonstrate that none could appear anymore, presumably referring to that for no obligation to have imam could exist. It was generally agreed that God did not impose impossible duties on the believers. How the ascetics argued we do not know, but one way or the other they all denied that the imams were God-given. In other words, they all desacralized. It did not reflect the absolute. It was just a fallible human institution like any other. They did not say that it was a bad institution, that God originally meant people to live without it. They merely denied that God had any views on its desirability or otherwise. Given that imams was simply a human convention, one could have it or not as one saw fit. People have it in the past and have worked very well, but nowadays it was preferable, even unnecessary, to do without it. In short, they cut the link between the Imam and the law on which Islamic society rested. That's how they made anarchism possible. In doing without the Imam, but how would one manage without applying the law and Imam? Above all, who dispatched the penalties of which so-called Hudu? They essentially agreed they could only be applied by the Imam of his circumstance, no private representative. Under normal, the normal another believer, the person who allowed to kill or maim law did. However, stipulated certain crimes such as thief, adultery, etc., were punishable by death, amputation, flogging. These penalties were among God's rights, i.e., they were requisite for their greater good, and public figures were required for theirs. This obviously suggests execution, that having an imam vests legal duty, and presumably for this reason they would do long large in military surviving matters, discussing without question how one must manage imams attracts less attention, and there is no discussion at all whether one will find religious guidance. After all, the 9th century Muslims generally saw the imam as religious guides or teacher, but maybe this simply reflects the fragmentary state of evidence. In any case, the Muslim grammar more responsible partly with a pro-as regard the former. The reanimated partly with practical proposal. They sharp on female cooperation and taking duty seriously. Degree people's welfare lies entirely on which everybody had cooperated, and some of them point out participate no people guilty of crime, and shrinking was allowed, even they do their bit by giving themselves up voluntarily. As regard the latter, the proposal ranged from dissolution of public complete authority to drastic decentralization. The complete dissolution of public authority seemed to be what the Ishma al-Fulah and Abda'i Saruyama had in mind. Since no legitimate authority exists, people would take the law into their own hands wherever they could ensure the law was applied. Self-help was encouraged, even when it entails killing, even when killing had to be done on the sly. Better still, people would rebel and openly take over the implementation of the law, including the amputation of Phoebe hands, the execution of murderers, and everything else the Imam used to do. Sounds like a prescription for anarchy, in normal sense of chaos and disorder. This is less anarchic view. The other Islamic proposed trustworthy and leaders of households, districts, tribes, and towns who applied the law within their jurisdiction, and they qualified to carry out the hudu. In other words, power should revert to patriarchs and local leaders, domestic tyrants, and local thugs in modern parlance. But others were reluctant to do without public authority altogether. In their view, one could elect temporary imams. This could be done whenever legal dispute arose or crimes were committed, or when the enemy invaded. The imam would lose his position as soon as he finished the job. Such as the imam in the sense of prayer leader loses authority the moment the prayer is over. One assumed that he was above mentioned leader of the household, district, tribe, or towns that they would have in mind as candidates. But in the case for these Muslims, he really wanted the government to be taken over by elected officials. Al-Assam played a sufficient number to minimize the danger of bias and coalition. They would replace the imam for purpose of maintaining the law and applying the hudu. In other words, one would have to govern by a executive committee. Al-Assam also advanced a proposal for extreme decentralization. One could have severe semi-independent imams. One imam had been fine in the days of the first caliphs, he said, but nowadays they could no longer be real anonymity, just one man. He would not know miraculous people in distant provinces, meaning as Assam saw it, he could not collaborate with professional elites. This, he said, was frustrating for those who wished to participate in government, as it would be better to have several imams, and this was perfectly lawful. He ought to have continued to say that Imanat is a human convention. We can do what we like with it, but at this point he seemed to have lost his nerve. He tried to legitimate his proposal by invoking prophetic precedents. He claimed that the Prophet's governors in Arabia had in effect been independent imams. Each one had been collecting taxes, maintaining order, conduct defense, tell people the law, and when the Prophet died, the inhabitants of each province center had inherited the right to appoint such governors of their own. In short, all provinces were now entitled to elect their own semi-independent rulers, who would of course have to cooperate. Al-Jaziz scoffed at this proposal. Whoever heard of neighborhood rulers who did not fight? But what I say was grappling was clearly the concept of federation. No such concept existed. He did not quite arrive at it either, for he did not explain what would hold the government together now the prophet had died. But it is nonetheless a remarkable piece of political thinking. It's hardly surprising that he lost his nerve, for the proposed that Muslim community will be divided among a number of imams was even more heretical than saying they could be do without imams altogether. Al-Assam never dared to publish this proposal. He merely told his close friends and pupils about it. This was to lay the foundation of anarchism in the Middle East, especially in Islam, and we see several revolts throughout the 7th, 8th, and 9th century by the Qadarites and the Najarites. This will lay the foundation. Sadly, even though it disappeared, there's been a resurgence of Islamic anarchism.